Hello, and welcome to the second podcast episode of The Loop by ViewsHub, a monthly review where we discuss the future of workplace feedback, team performance, personality traits, and organizational competitiveness. In this edition, we sit down with Dr. Alessandro Nai, Associate Professor of Political Communication at the University of Amsterdam. We discuss personality and behavioral traits in a particularly pertinent context, politics. We focus on how one can assess the personality traits, including the dark triad traits of the world's most prominent political leaders. We discuss what impact they can have on voter behavior and electoral fortune, and consider the fueling factors behind the rise of populism across the world. We also evaluate the impacts that personality and behavioral traits can have on a politician's performance in office. It proves a very interesting discussion founded upon much of Dr. Nai's own research projects and data. I hope you enjoy. Alessandro, very nice to meet you.
Good morning, nice to meet you.
Albeit virtually. I'm really excited by this podcast because the topic that you specialize in is something that's both of huge interest to me personally, but of course is also very salient given all the forthcoming elections during the course of this year and in the next couple of years. So it's a fascinating time to be talking about in particular political leaders and their personality traits and how that impacts voting outcomes and indeed performance once each of these individuals gets into power. But let me start off by quickly introducing myself. So my name is Banerjee. I am CEO of ViewsHub. And ViewsHub is an enterprise platform that uses real-time dynamic feedback to get views on you, the individual, to get views on your teams, the various teams that you work with, and to get views on your organization from co-workers, from clients, and from indeed anyone else that knows you. And using those feedback mechanisms, we provide everyone with a behavioral map of how they are perceived by the people who they work with. And that creates all kinds of interesting analytical outcomes. So you can track what your personality is like based on how others perceive you. You can see how your own behavioral traits interacts with those of your team members. You can measure cognitive diversity. You can measure things like psychological safety within a team. You can measure the growth mindset of an individual, and you can also measure client feedback and client perceptions and preempt churn much more dynamically and in real time than otherwise might be possible. So that's broadly speaking ViewsHub. But one of the aspects of ViewsHub that is particularly relevant to the research that you are doing is the focus on measuring the perceptions of people's behaviors and personality traits based on other people that might know them. And when it comes to political leaders, of course, it's much broader than that because everyone has a perception of political leaders, especially the national leaders. So trying to encapsulate that is something that we're particularly interested in. And the work that you have been doing, measuring personality traits, but also something particularly interesting, the dark side traits, I think was really interesting. So let me hand it over to you, and if you could introduce yourself. But also just give us an outline of the work you're doing on the personality traits of political leaders, particularly the dark side traits, how they are measured and how they affect voter behavior, or indeed are affected by voter prejudices.
Yeah, thanks, Ab. First of all, absolutely wonderful to be here with you. I was excited to receive the invitation. I'm delighted to discuss with you this morning. My name is Alex Nai. I'm an associate professor of political communication at the University of Amsterdam. Even though I work at a communication department, I'm actually a political scientist, and my work is sort of in between the two. So I start from a political science angle, mostly framed in terms of political psychology. So this perfectly aligns also with the goal and approach of your organization. Trying to investigate the political psychology dynamics of political communication. It is a mouthful, but what this means basically is we put those who produce the message at the center, in this case, leaders, and this is what we will discuss today. But we don't simply investigate leader, we'd also investigate the consequences for voters, for citizens, for you and me, for us, when they are exposed to what leaders say and who leaders are. This is basically my research agenda in 3 words. Now, if you go a little bit deeper into what I do more recently, this focus on the dark side of politics, or the dark personality side of voters and leaders. You started this interview by saying that it's a fascinating period to investigate that. I fully agree. And me, myself, and colleagues, we always feel a little bit better of being excited about working about this, because yes, there is a lot to do and to say. But of course, it's not an easy topic. It's a topic potentially problematic with potentially dramatic consequences downstream from a systemic standpoint for democratic consolidation and deconsolidation. Perhaps we can discuss about this later on. But you asked me to quickly summarize my research. So what we have been doing for the past 6-7 years is try to map the personality profile of political leaders worldwide. And by the way, when I say leaders, I mean high-level political actors. This is not simply people that are elected to the executive of their country, but also party leaders, main political actors at the national level. So think like the 5 to 10 most prominent political figures. We've been doing this for every country that has held elections since 2016, I believe. So now we have a huge data set of the personality profile, including the dark personality profile of leaders.
Sorry, does that go all the way up to today, or where does it stop?
Yes, absolutely. The data collection is actually ongoing. Every time that there is an election worldwide, we relaunch the survey. We go again in the field, and we try to complete the data set. So right now, I believe data is being collected for the last election in Russia. We can of course discuss whether it was a free and fair election. Usually that's our cutoff point. The election needs to be free and fair. We decided to go into the field mostly to get also information about the personality of Vladimir Putin. But yes, absolutely. Data collection is still ongoing. Every couple of years, we create the data set where we blend all the information, and then we continue. Data collection is based on expert surveys, which is, in our opinion, a key advantage, a key exciting feature of our research project. Also comes with major limitation that we need to take into account. So what does it mean? Relying on expert data, it simply means that because we cannot access first-hand self-reports about the personality of political leaders, we cannot send Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, Angela Merkel a questionnaire and say, please fill this questionnaire. We can just not do. We need to find alternative ways. There are a few ways to do this. Analyze their speech production, for instance, which has pros and cons. What we have decided to do is to rely on ratings of experts, scholars that are experts in politics, in communication, in leadership in each of these countries. We ask them a series of targeted, specific, standardized questions. We average them, and we try to filter out a couple of biases that are implicit in observers' assessment of personality of someone else, which we can also discuss. And then once we have the data, we try to see where it comes from and what are the consequences of these personality traits of leaders.
That's really interesting. The whole concept of getting information from experts is, of course, fraught with all kinds of difficulties, as you already.
Oh yes.
Have you measured the standard deviation of the judgments from the experts on each of the different political leaders that you track? And are there some which are much tighter than others? Is there a much bigger spread on some and much tighter spread on others?
Absolutely. This is a fantastic question. You're absolutely right. You go directly to the core of our limitations. I would say there are two things that we need to make sure if we want to convince reader that we are doing something that is systematic and comparable. We need to convince readers or observers that our raters, our experts, converge. They sort of agree with each other. And that's the standard deviation issue, which I will discuss in a sec. But then we also need to convince them that on average, that the average experts is objective, right? Because if all experts converge but they're all biased, we have a very low standard deviation, which is biased. So we need to do both, right? Let me start with the first. Low standard deviation, absolutely. We are actually surprised if you compare evaluations of political leaders done by experts. By the way, when I say expert, I really mean scholars that work on politics, right? Yeah. When you compare evaluation of the personality of leaders by experts and by the public at large, experts have a much lower standard deviation. They converge much more. It makes sense for two reasons. On the one hand, well, they are experts, right? So they should be potentially more objective. On the other hand, likely, and this is our intuition, they have access to a much broader, wider range of let's call them data inputs to form their own judgment. It's unlikely that they simply form their judgment by seeing politicians in the news. Maybe they also watch clips, they go to rallies, they investigate their production, they really study these leaders, right? So the judgment is much more precise. Your question was about whether there is a higher or lower standard deviation. In other terms, that experts are more or less precise. Certainly, the more famous the politician, the more precise the judgment, which is both a boon and a bane, because it means that we can have better prediction for famous leaders, but famous leaders are those for which we need the least prediction, probably, right? We would like to be able to investigate also the emergence of potentially new leaders that are able to change and shift the dynamics. And for those new leaders, we might not necessarily always have a good set of prediction. Let me give you an example. Let's say that in a country, there is a new party on the rise, spearheaded by a very charismatic leader. These type of new parties with charismatic leaders are likely to shift the political balance in the country, which means we need to investigate those actors. But of course, because they are new, there is less materials on which experts can base their judgment and so forth. And if I can also super quickly tackle the second point, whether beyond the standard deviation or beyond consensus among experts, their judgment in the first place are valid or biased. That's an extremely important area that needs to be tackled. We know in the West, but also in the developing South, that there is a certain partial liberal tendency in academia. This is something that has been measured in many ways, proven many times, which simply means, given that experts are also human beings, that there is a chance that experts might translate into their judgment a certain type of motivated reasoning. In other terms, they might be slightly more critical towards political actor that they dislike, which is normal. We are all human beings, right? We tend to be more critical towards politicians we dislike, including when it comes to their personality. If we look at our data, we do see a little bit of this type of trend. Right-wing experts tend to be more critical towards left-wing leaders and vice versa, which prompted us to use a series of statistical ways to correct this bias. We use regression residual, which I'm happy to discuss in case of. All this to say that experts converge. They might be slightly biased, but we have ways to tackle that.
Interesting. Okay. And have you been able to compare the scholar opinion, I'm not going to call them expert, the scholar opinion, with the popular opinion, voters' perceptions?
Yes, we have done that. Of course, it's tricky. We cannot do it across the world, right? Because it would require survey data across the world, which we don't have. We were able to do it for several countries. We did it, if I'm not mistaken, for the Netherlands or for the US several times.
Okay.
And if we think of major political actors today in the US, let's say Donald Trump, which is a very interesting example, regardless of how we feel politically about Donald Trump, right? From an academic standpoint, is an interesting example. What we see when we compare perceptions of the public and perceptions of the experts is that the two population of observers diverge on some traits and converge in other traits. Specifically, when it comes to extraversion, bombastic projection of the self, and narcissism, also bombastic projection of the self, both the experts and the public agree, regardless of their political leaning, that Donald Trump scores very high. If you ask a random sample of American respondents, regardless of whether they are strong Democrats, strong Republicans, they will tell you, yeah, Donald Trump is very extroverted. They will also agree that he's sort of slightly high in narcissism. Little bit difference there between Democrats and Republicans. On other traits, though, agreeableness, conscientiousness, psychopathy, experts are much more consensual. The public, extremely diverse. If you look at the public, when it comes for conscientiousness, strong Republicans will say that Donald Trump is very conscientious. Strong Democrats would say that Donald Trump is not at all. And this is clearly motivated reasoning, partisan bias.
How do you explain that? So if a Republican voter considers Donald Trump to be extremely agreeable, someone he's happy to go and have a beer with in the local bar, whereas a Democrat would absolutely stay away and spit blood at the idea of it. How do you explain that? How do you explain that perceptual difference?
Yeah, I would say if I had to pinpoint to one of the key issues to understand contemporary politics, especially in the US, also in the UK, and in many European countries, I would say is the role of partisan bias and motivated reasoning. It drives absolutely everything today. Every time that we see in the news stuff, news items about January 6th, storming of the Capitol, about affective polarization, about disagreement, about violence, everything is driven by radicalized partisan perceptions today, from a political psychology standpoint. Because political identity are so entrenched in the US, but everywhere, but let's say in the US, political identities become such a central component of the identity with capital I of who we are as a human being. Everything is seen through the lens of partisanship, including, and this is both the motivated reasoning process and the selective perception process, including accepting only the evidence that we like and rejecting all the evidence that we dislike. This is a little bit of a caricature. If you are a strong conservative, you will cherry pick all the components, all the elements, all the items, all the examples that you see in Donald Trump that confirm the fact that he's a nice guy and discard the rest. If you are a strong Democrat, you do the opposite.
Yeah.
Another way to say this, everything from politics, but also to music, everything today is political. We are doing a separate research with colleagues in Lausanne where we try to investigate if musical preferences are driven by politics. And we see, like, using a series of experimental cues, we see, for instance, whether people tell you that they like Taylor Swift or Kanye West depend on whether they are strong Republicans or Democrat. And you can cue that. If you remind them that they are liberal, they like Taylor Swift much more, and vice versa. So everything goes through this partisan lens that determines who we are.
Very, very interesting stuff. You talk about the specific traits that you measure. And of course, you've got the big five that you measure, the openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which I think you describe in a slightly different way, but we can come back to that. But you also talk about the dark side traits. I can't remember what you call it, the triad, the dark triad or something.
Yes.
Can you just run through the dark side traits in particular and define each of them, I guess?
Yes, absolutely. If you take a step back and you look at the literature on personality for the past 20 years or so, it has really consolidated on this big five that sort of provide a socially desirable profile of humans. This is why, by the way, we use the reverse of neuroticism, which we call emotional stability. Right, in this sense, all the five traits, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, can be seen, if the scores are high, as being socially acceptable, socially desirable.
Right.
10, 15 years ago, research in cognitive psychology, social psychology realized that there is a dark side of personality, which cannot simply be captured by low scores on the big five. So it goes beyond the being low in agreeableness. And this is what is called the dark side of personality. There are several inventories. The most famous one, I would say, is the so-called dark triad, which identifies three main socially nefarious traits. So the first one is narcissism. Very important in politics, of course. What is narcissism? Well, it's very easy to define. It implies self-aggrandizing ideas, promotion of the self, bombastic behaviors. Basically, when it comes to politics, a strong desire to be in the spotlight. From a psychological standpoint, it's a little bit more complicated because there is also a vulnerable component of narcissism. Very often we realize that people that are that project an image of narcissism, they do so because they are insecure. So to compensate a sort of insecurity, they project a strong narcissistic vibe. We cannot go that far with our data. This is the first. Right. Second one, perhaps the most important in politics, is the so-called psychopathy. Psychopathy is, of course, not related necessarily to being a psychopath and going around and killing people serial killer style. It's not what we're discussing about. Psychopathy is nothing else than a lack of emotional connection with other human beings. The incapacity to click emotionally when thinking about you, other, and your relationship with other. Very often psychopaths are described as cold, impulsive, also unable to understand that maybe their actions have negative consequences for other people, lack of empathy, this is what we call psychopathy. And then the third,
are they also described as being charming, or is that
yes, absolutely. The psychopath, also the sociopath, there's a little bit of difference between the two. the psychopath can be charming and also very socially, I'm blanking on the term, socially successful. It can be a very adaptive term, because of the disregard of potential consequences and emotion. It's very easy, quote unquote, and I'm simplifying here, for a psychopath to simply project the image that the other people would like to see in them.
Right.
Psychopathy is also related to social boldness. Psychopaths are not shy. They are at the center of the attention. They are energetic. They like to be bold and brave and potentially impulsive in a positive and a negative way, right? I know it sounds extremely bad, psychopathy, and yes, from a social relationship standpoint, lack of emotionality is problematic, but there is also potentially positive, right? Very often, especially when it comes to challenging situation, we say we need a strong person that really acts on their impulses and really gets us through the finishing line. That's what psychopathy is, right? So yeah,
Decisive.
yeah, decisive, absolutely decisiveness. So, which, by the way, I'm making a quick aside. It's very easy to make a mistake, and I'm sure I do it very often when we discuss about this dark trait, to portray them as intrinsically absolutely bad with only negative consequences. That's
Right.
often the case, but certainly not always by far, which is very important to say. And then quickly, the third. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to interrupt
Yeah,
again. So as you described that psychopathy and some of the underlying behaviors around that, socially successful potentially, I was thinking about successful salespeople.
Yes.
Successful salespeople, you kind of almost want them to have some of these traits because that's what you need in order to close the deal.
Absolutely. There is research, by the way. No, 100%. Of course, my expertise is in politics, but I read a bit around this. There is quite a bit of research on work relationship and on business that shows that the share of, once again, quote unquote, psychopaths, it sounds very bad, but that's what it is, right? Tend to be higher level of business enterprises, because this is more successful people that sort of push through the finishing line, right? It can have negative consequences, which you can also discuss, but absolutely, when it comes to decisiveness, impulsivity, even potentially creativity, being unbound by emotional considerations, right? If we discuss about this in purely objective terms, that's what we're talking about. Yeah. And of course, we discuss about business in politics as well. Having a psychopathic personality in leaders both helps leaders of being more decisive regardless of consequences, but is potentially also seen by voters as being strong, decisive, especially in terms of crisis. We know the rally around the flag effect. When there is a huge crisis in your country, you turn towards leaders, strong leaders. When we call what we call strong leaders, strong men, very often they score very high in psychopathy. That's what we meant. Then is a third trait, very interesting, much more nuanced, much harder also to grasp. Is Machiavellianism. Of course, comes from the Italian philosopher Machiavelli. Machiavellianism, related to the other two traits, is the tendency, the proclivity to engage in scheming behavior, to once again not really think about the consequences of what you do, only think about the full outcome, strategic thinking linked to dishonesty, potentially unethical behaviors, because what matters is the ultimate goal and not the consequences along the way.
Right. Yeah. The end justifies the means.
The end justifies the means is absolutely a perfect way. By the way, the end justifies the means. It's at the perfect intersection between Machiavellianism and psychopathy, right? The lack of care for the consequences, that is psychopathy component, right? I don't care how many eggs I need to break to do the omelette. But the focus on the means, regardless of how you get there, and the fact that you need to be strategic to do that, that's Machiavellianism.
Okay, I mean, it kind of reminds me a little bit of some ancient Greek philosophy, hedonists versus Epicureans. So the hedonists will just want to enjoy their life regardless of the consequences, regardless of any pain that they may cause.
Absolutely.
Wants to also have pleasure, but without that causing pain to others. So that empathy aspect of it.
Absolutely, and I think there is research in social psychology that shows that people that score high on the dark traits, especially on psychopathy, are also higher in hedonism, which is of course something that you can measure from a psychological standpoint, which is exactly what you're saying.
So you've got these personality traits, you've got the big five, and now you've got the three dark side traits. Why are personality traits a key metric at all in which to approach voting, elections, and politics more broadly, rather than perhaps the policies of the parties and the manifestos.
Yeah, absolutely. With colleagues, we work on personality and on campaigns, and we tend to dive directly into, we can see the consequences and so forth. But sometimes we forget to ask ourselves this fundamental question: why focus on personality in the first place? The reason, at least from a human standpoint, is that personality is a deep construct in our mind, even in our body. Personality determines who we are deep down, is potentially even more deep when it comes to psychological construct that our values. Values, of course, are the glasses that we put on ourselves to see world and social relations. Personality is even deeper than that. It's how we see the world and how we see ourselves in the world. And the reason why this is important, well, on the one hand, because it defines who we are. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, because they tend to be relatively stable over a lifetime-ish. I mean, there are, of course, fluctuation in personality, especially at the margin. There's a lot of fluctuation, but like let's say the core personality is unlikely to shift on the short term. It's not like we are extroverted on weekends and super shy during the week. We are either extroverted or we are shy as a person, more or less. I'm simplifying. And the third reason, the most important one, is quite some evidence that who we are deep down drives the way we think and the way we behave in society. In other terms, personality is important because it's deep, it's stable, and predicts a lot of stuff, right? One of the key challenges for social scientists, for political scientists, when you investigate attitudes and behavior, is that all this more surface stuff tend to influence each other, right? Mm-hmm. Are we more left-leaning because we vote for left-leaning parties, or we vote for left-leaning parties because we are left-leaning, right? What is the direction of the causality? It's tricky. With personality, that is a little bit less of a problem because personality is so deep, so linked to who we are, and so stable that potentially it has more consequences than causes, so to speak. And this is why it's so important.
And I guess it's also connected to, I mean, you've got the policy manifestos, the policy platforms of the political parties that the leaders represent. But ultimately, with all things political, it's down to how you respond to crises and events that come out of the blue, pandemic or Ukraine war or whatever it is. The personality then comes to the fore, how you respond to emergencies and crises. And that's, I guess, voters really want to be able to determine and judge and say, do I trust this person to be able to handle that?
Absolutely. And this is why personality is also so important electorally. As you said, a voter, when they're facing a choice, whom to vote for during an election, they can either choose based on their predispositions without really considering who the actors are. Like, I like Tories, I vote for the Tories, right? Or they can choose based on the party platform, campaign and promises and policies and messages and arguments, right? Mm-hmm. I'm a blank slate. I look what the best policies are and I go in this direction. Or they can choose, once again, oversimplifying, they can choose based on who the leaders are. Mm. And the reason why this is actually not a stupid thing to do, it's because trying to assess who the leaders are should allow us to project the way they will behave when it matters. Mm-hmm. That's exactly the example that you made, a series of examples that you made. One thing is to conduct high-level policy and implement programs when everything is fine. Rarely everything is fine in politics. There is always momentous shifts and wars and famine and pandemics. And because we know this, and because we are also risk-averse in general as human beings, somehow, consciously, unconsciously, we tend to project, we tend to imagine the way that these leaders would behave when it matters. And one way that we do so, without knowing it, right, is to see who they are as human beings. And this is where an absolutely fascinating phenomenon comes into play, the so-called halo effect or homophily effect. Homophily effect implies that we tend to be more sympathetic towards leaders that showcase a personality profile that somehow clicks with ours, that matches a little bit ours, right? If I'm extremely high in conscientiousness or agreeableness, I tend to gravitate more towards this type of leaders. And the reason why is because I assume that because they are like me, they will behave in a way that I will like in the future. And these are, of course, very complex mechanisms at the intersection of who the leaders are, who the voters are, and the interaction between the two, which is very complex to map, of course.
So the interesting thing about that is how one of the underlying trends that one picks up on globally is the growth of populism and demagoguery.
Yeah.
And yeah, we have to be kind of careful about the definitions of those two terms. If that is true, that there is the growth of populism, etc., is that a reflection of a polarized society choosing the kinds of leaders that they identify with, or is it because the leaders have suddenly turned up and they're leading the electorate?
I mean, let me start by saying that there are many PhD theses that could be done on this topic. It's a vast topic, but is an absolutely key one. You're right. You mentioned we should be careful with using these terms. I completely agree. But there is still a consensual sort of a consensus among experts and observers about especially populism. For the sake of simplicity, let's say that populism is, and this will be in my answer, populism is a tendency of political actors to see and frame political dynamics in terms of a main conflict between the people and the elites. So is these two main characteristics of populism: people centrism, us, we, the people, pure, needs to be cherished, needs to be protected against attacks from the outside, but also against attacks from the elite. So this horizontal and vertical conflict. If political actors somehow take a stance in this direction, elites are corrupt, the people needs to be protected, this is what we call populism. So it's not left, it's not right, it's really a political spice that you can put on top of any platforms. And it's true.
It's a call to the emotions of the electorate and finding a common enemy.
Exactly, absolutely. Along this line, framing the debate, framing issues, whichever issues along this line, implies using a populist frame. Absolutely. And it's true. There is some evidence. I mean, this is debated in the literature, but there is some evidence that this is becoming an important feature of modern politics, let's say. Let me simplify. Whether this is something that drastically increased in recent years, since Brexit, for instance, or Trump and Brexit 2016, or whether it's simply the media that have picked up something that was here before, is something that we don't have probably the time to discuss. But it's true that populism is essential to today's politics, let's say like this. And the question is, why? What are the reasons, especially when it comes to, one, voters, and two, what we have been discussing so far, who these leaders are, personality. Multiple things to say here. On the one hand, when it comes to leaders themselves, we are starting to have quite a bit of evidence. Populist leaders have a very specific personality profile. I would even say the link between personality and populism is much stronger than the link between personality and left-wing, right-wing political positions. So populism, from an ideological standpoint, seems to be what is really almost, we could almost talk about a populist personality. What is this populist personality? There are different lines. I'm not going to go too much into details, but just to give an idea. Populist leaders tend to score high on extraversion, for instance, tend to score low on conscientiousness, and tend to score high on the dark traits. What is the combination of these three sort of trends indicate? Well, it showcases a figure of a populist as a political actor that wants to diverge from the quote-unquote norm, that is not here to make friends, that is here to shake the tree of politics as usual and see which apples will fall down and how. One of the best metaphors in the literature on populism is that populism are like drunken dinner guests. They come to the dinner party, which is very formal. They come late. They are drunk. They are loud. They spill the wine. They are maybe also a little bit vulgar, and then they leave, and everyone is left to wonder what exactly happened, reshaping completely the atmosphere of the dinner. Right. And this is what is picked up by this personality. They're very extroverted. They are low in conscientiousness. They're a little bit all over the place, but also maybe they have disregard for norms and ethics and consequences. So from the political leader standpoint, dark personality, high extroversion, and populism go hand in hand. And to answer your question based on this, how does this explain contemporary societal dynamics? Well, that's trickier. The problem is it goes both ways, and we don't know which comes first, the chicken and egg situation. So on the one hand, we know that polarized voters that are populist themselves, like voters that score high in populist attitude. So voters they themselves, they say, elite are corrupt. We need to be careful towards foreigners and so forth. Populist voters tend to have a preference for leaders that have a dark personality profile. If I simplify, a populist voter is more likely to elect a psychopath. But we also know that there is also the reverse effect. We are starting to see evidence that having dark leaders in the spotlight in the first place creates downstream voters that are more aggressive. So populist leaders feed on, let's say, affective polarization and party dislike and sort of partisan conflict. They feed on that to get elected, but they also enhance it downstream. And what comes first? Well, it's hard to say.
So you basically get into a feedback loop, positive
Yeah,
feedback loop, and
absolutely.
it just each reinforces the other until you get to a point where either performance is good or performance is chaotic, and the whole thing breaks down.
Exactly. You said feedback loop. It's absolutely true. In my subfield of the literature, this is what we call a reinforcing spiral, but it's the same idea.
Right.
I actually like the idea of the spiral because there is two dimensions, right? There is the circular component, the loop, but the spiral also goes up or down. So there is a sort of a spiral is three-dimensional. It's almost like a vortex that goes down, 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 or up, 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 until the point where potentially the breaking point.
So I've got a slightly different question. So we've identified the personality traits. We've looked at which traits might be correlated with populist ideas and populist leaders, and which comes first. Is it the people that are more into populism and looking for scapegoats and looking for their voices to be heard, because that's the feeling and emotion that they often have. They don't feel that they're being represented, and the representative democracy is actually failing them. They want direct democracy. Once leaders get into power, they've positioned themselves almost from a marketing perspective to fill a gap in the market from the point of view of electorate's desires. And so whether they're actually psychopathic or whether they've decided that they need to be perceived as being psychopathic in order to fill that marketing gap. I mean, ultimately, elections are the biggest consumer marketing proposition on the planet, right? You have to get the entire adult population to vote in your direction and buy your product. So positioning your product, which is your personality, to leverage on whichever gap that you've identified and the size of that gap, how much of it is actually marketing rather than the actual personality? And do political leaders' personalities change once they've got into power? Or is it very consistent as it is actually their authentic self?
That's an absolutely fascinating question. I think you put your finger on one of the key difficulties in this literature on the personality of leaders from a methodological standpoint, but also from a substantive standpoint, to what extent leaders are honest about who they are. As you said, let's say that they assess that the leader needs a strongman, and I use a strongman in a gender neutral way, right? So the way it's been defined, right? Let's say they assess that the country needs a psychopath. Do they self-select into the job because they know that they're a psychopath, or they beef up the psychopathic profile to fit into the hole? This is fascinating also because this type of consideration reflect one of the personality traits. This type of consideration is exactly what Machiavellianism is about, right? Shifting who you are, shifting what you say to sort of, right? And this is tricky. So are people high in psychopathy or maybe a low in psychopathy but high in Machiavellianism? Very hard to say. Very hard to say. But this is absolutely fundamental, especially when it comes to more polarized system where political competition goes up. We know today of the importance of unique selling propositions when it comes to candidates. We know today the importance of simplifying your product from a political marketing standpoint, and the consequences of this you can see at all levels. You can see in terms of the complexity of the language that is used by political actors. Clearly, when competition goes up, they have incentives of reducing the complexity of the language, otherwise they lose part of the electorate. They need to simplify to cast a wider net. So the consequences are profound. Whether or not they are showcasing their true personality or their play on their personality can potentially be assessed indeed, as your intuition goes, by comparing who they are from a personality standpoint when they compete with who they are when they're in office. Once the election is over, let's say, once there is no need anymore, and I'm simplifying, once there is no need anymore to sort of sway the electorate and convince, right? They are there.
Exactly. It's a difference between the campaigning style versus the governing style.
Exactly, campaigning versus governing. We don't have a lot of evidence about this. Also, because in my opinion, it would require repeated election. to sort of see the bidirectional way, right? Okay, maybe they changed during the governing period, but because something else happened. Like, let's say that a person, let's say that Donald Trump changed his personality in yeah, not a good example. Political leader changed his personality after being elected in the year when the pandemic, when the COVID pandemic happened.
Right.
Is the personality changed because of the election or because of the pandemic? We don't know. So a way to really test this would be to do models where we have election governing period, and see the direction. For instance, we have a series of data from Israel about Bibi Netanyahu's subsequent election and winning and subsequent election that we are just starting now to investigate. What I can say for now is that yes, personality of these leaders, at least as assessed by experts, adjusts a little bit. It is absolutely possible that leaders tend to showcase a tougher personality during the campaign, because we know today, especially in competitive circumstances, that strong leaders have an edge. And then maybe try to maybe potentially mellow down a little bit, including when it comes to their personality once they access power. There are plenty of examples in this sense. Giorgia Meloni in Italy, for instance, right? Everyone's super afraid, and then, of course, mellowing down a little bit when starting to face the reality of what governing is. In the Netherlands as well. Last year, November election in which a political party spearheaded by a politician with a very dark personality from an objective standpoint won. And just right after the election, the first messages that this politician put out was a sort of more conciliatory tone. It's like, let's work together. This is classic examples.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, possibly. There is actually a very high likelihood that politicians play on this.
Right, and it all depends on the market environment. So if you're a marketing strategist, and I consider the likes of Donald Trump to be exceptionally good marketeers, they look at the market environment, which is the electorate and the nature of the economy and the social battles that go on. Absolutely. And if you're in an environment where the resources are limited, you know whether you might want to be a maverick outsider or a technocratic insider. And you described the dinner party guest as an example. That sounds like a classic maverick outsider.
Absolutely.
And so you position yourself as a maverick. Like Nigel Farage positions himself very much as a maverick outsider.
Excellent example.
Boris Johnson is an interesting example because he always positions himself as a maverick, but an insider, because he's been in positions of power for quite a long time, mayor of London for 2 terms, etc. So there does seem to be an element of you position yourself in a particular way to, first of all, and you go to the extreme to get the nomination from your political party, which, as you said, is increasingly polarized. So you go to the extreme to get the nomination from the political party, then you move a little bit to the center to win the election overall. And then when you get into power, you change a little bit more because you've got the reality of actually governing and handling difficult situations.
Absolutely.
So it's a very kind of it's a moving feast, isn't it? And if you're a good politician, then you do move. But if you really are a psychopathic in the psychological sense, maybe you don't. Maybe that's who you are.
You wouldn't. Exactly.
Because that is exactly who you are. But it kind of raises the question mark about, and I know you don't necessarily specialize in this, but the idea of not just the cult of the leader, but the leadership team, and in particular, in whether it's in the US or the UK. US, you have a running mate, right? So there's a lot of discussion about who's going to be. You may have the presidential candidate, but who's the running mate? And when Trump chose Mike Pence previously, Mike Pence was almost the polar opposite in many ways of Trump. So he chose him deliberately in order to appeal to a broader electorate. So that sounds like it's much more Machiavellian than psychopathic or narcissistic.
Absolutely. That is 100% strategic behavior. It's true, it's not my expertise, but if I can project my expertise on this type of dynamics, I would even say this is a perfect example of the halo effect, homophily effect that we were discussing before in politics, but also beyond politics, right? We tend to be attracted to people that have a personality profile that clicks with ours. we always say, oh, people are attracted by opposite personality. I'm not sure there's a lot of evidence about that. There's more pop science. We tend to, there are reasons to believe that we are attracted to people that have matching personality, that we can click somehow, in politics as well. Now, what does it mean about leadership teams? Well, if one leader can attract the support of people that are like them, there is an extremely strong strategic advantage of bringing into the leadership team someone with a different personality profile to attract other people. Right. So the more different the heads of the leadership team are in terms of personality, the higher the chances that this homophily effect covers almost as a blanket a higher share of the population. There is a risk, though, of course, which is exactly related to this dynamic of homophily. We just said that people that have a similar personality like each other. So bringing into the leadership people with extremely different personality reduces the chances that they will like each other, which can potentially have consequences downstream. So it's a sort of a double bind, right? You need to want to be extremely different to capture more the attention and support of the public, but the more different you are, the higher the chances of conflict.
Taking the personality traits, looking at whether they're electorally successful, and then going beyond that to determining whether their performance has actually been successful in government. Presumably, you don't do that because that's a different set of questions altogether. Judging the performance of these leaders once they become the executive. Have you done any research in that? Have you looked at any traits which are correlated more with actual performance?
Yes. This is preliminary for us, but we have looked at two different sets of indicators. We have tried to look into, if I simplify, short-term and long-term indicators, more or less, or policy outputs versus systemic effects. So this may be the better way to discuss. And more specifically, we have looked into three sets of issues. First, economic performance. We have zoomed in on the leaders that were elected, only those that were elected. We looked at their personality. And then we compare the economic performance of the country in terms of GDP growth, changes in GDP, between the year in which the leader was elected and the year after, which means, right, there is a lag, meaning that potentially is not the high GDP that influences the election of the leader, is the other way around, right?
Yeah.
And what we find, perhaps unsurprisingly, strong leaders, including psychopaths, have a better economic performance.
Fascinating.
Yes. So there's higher, I believe the indicator for which there is the strongest effect is GDP growth. This is partial, of course, right? It's just for some countries, but still, from a statistical standpoint, it also controls by a lot of covariates. So we do find this. Where does this come from? Well, perhaps from what we were discussing earlier. Higher decisiveness, maybe higher impulsivity in a creative way, potentially also disregard of consequences, and putting more the accents on economic performance. And the result is, yes, indeed, a better economic performance. I believe there is also evidence that compares US presidents over time. Is more complicated if you go back in time, right? You need to sort of estimate, but let's assume it's okay. And I believe it also shows that leaders that have a darker-ish personality profile are more successful from an economic standpoint when it comes to economic recovery, getting out of recession, these kind of things in the US. Yeah. There's a price to pay, though. A strong price to pay.
There's a however.
However, exactly. However, there's a price to pay, and the price to pay is, well, these consequences. Like, right, we say, okay, the outcome might be good from an economic standpoint, but which eggs are you breaking in the way to get there? And we have looked at two types of eggs, so to speak, if I can use this simplistic metaphor. We have looked first at democratic indicators. There's a lot of comparative research done by The Economist, for instance, that try to assess the level of democracy, the level of human rights, the level of democratic indicators. One that we really like is, for instance, is the degree of deliberativeness of the country. How much high-level political discussions in a country take into account opinions that are different from the opinions of the leaders, right? Inclusiveness when it comes to policy and discussions and, big programs. Index of deliberative quality. Perhaps unsurprisingly, you elect a dark leader, you elect a psychopathic leader, these democratic indicators go down. So it is associated with economic strength or economic consolidation, but it's also associated with the democratic deconsolidation. The evidence is partial, but very clear. And then we looked at a second type of eggs or potentially nefarious consequences along the way. And this is societal impact, societal consequences. We looked more specifically at the handling of the COVID crisis. And what we found, controlling by a lot of stuff. So the results, I think, is a hill I would be happy to die on. Electing strong leaders with the dark personality traits is associated in the first 6 months, all things considered, with a higher mortality due to COVID. Because once again, you maybe care more about like ultimate consequences and not the eggs that you break in the way. So there is always a shiny side and a dark side in this type of, we know this there's not a mystery, right? This is a house of cards. You adjust on one hand and then you weaken it at the other hand, and that's it. That's politics.
So the performance indicators are economic, are social, are cultural.
Yeah.
And of course, the whole construct between democracy and authoritarianism, and how one goes in either direction. So with dark side traits, you have higher economic performance, but greater potential social costs and greater risks to democratic institutions.
Yes.
But you might get re-elected because ultimately people may just care about the economic benefit.
It's the economy, stupid, right? As they always say. Depends on the country, but at least in some countries we know that is the way it works. Huh? Yeah.
Right. And that could explain why, okay, this might sound a bit contentious, but that could explain why China continues to have an authoritarian communist government, because the people are enjoying the fruits of the economic growth. But once that economic growth begins to slow down, maybe the balance shifts and you have new leaders that might try and emerge if they survive, who might try and push the alternative.
Absolutely. I'm by any means not an expert on China in any way, shape, or form, but I saw recently this graph. The share of the Chinese population below the poverty line. I have no idea how the poverty line was defined, probably also a moving average, right? I have no idea.
Yeah.
But I believe it's something like 20 years ago, it was half of the population, and today we are talking about 2% in 20 years. Of course, this has consequences in terms of how the leadership of the country is perceived by the population. I would say it would be naive not to think that this is the case. Yeah.
Okay. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to wrap up with a few quick questions. Actually, just one quick question, but three different examples. So, given your understanding of the political environments of the United States, the UK, and France, who do you think will win, Biden or Trump?
Trump, certainly.
Starmer or Sunak?
I don't know British politics enough. I would say Labour as a clear nudge ahead, but just because of polls. I don't know the personality of the two.
Because their personalities, neither of them I would say have dark
No,
side
exactly. I remember we did an analysis of Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn a few years ago, and they're both sort of relatively ish in the center. So there's not a lot to say when it comes to personality. Maybe that's British politics.
And finally, Macron or Le Pen?
I think Macron, especially now that he's once again perhaps shifting a little bit his image. He's putting out this, he's projecting this more strongman persona, and that's the only way to counteract the strongman projection of the Rassemblement National.
Fascinating. So in a world where resources are limited, where energy costs are getting higher because of the transition and fewer resources generally, when you're going to have that fight going on, the battle, there's no longer a win-win, there's a win-lose.
Yeah.
The most likely political outcomes are going to be those who show the strong leadership, who show the dark side traits.
I'm absolutely convinced of that. Yeah.
And Macron, interestingly, you said actually, and I think in your research, you showed that he does have some significant dark side traits.
He does. Is one of my favorite examples. When he started running with his own party, of course, he was in politics before. When he started running, I believe for the 2017 election, he created this new party on the move. I believe it's called in English. In French, is En Marche, EM. Yep. The initial is EM, which by chance or not, are exactly his own initials, right? So, of course, Macron is a narcissist, of course. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Alex, let me bring this interview to a close. Thank you so much for all your insights. And I'm absolutely fascinating, and I'd love to access some more of the research and see more of the correlation between traits and performance. I think is particularly interesting. It'll be also really interesting to see how combinations of leaders work together. So a president and the vice presidential pick, and do they usually choose people who are totally different from them or similar to them? who are subservient, who are just yes people, or do they try and win the marketing game and by appealing to a much broader electorate when it comes to the actual election rather than just their political parties?
That's
So
fascinating. I think you just gave me a research idea. I'm going to take a note about this and get back to you when we have results.
That'll be fantastic. Thank you once again so much.